Hello, good morning, and welcome. It's Wednesday, December the 10th, and Andy Burnham is at it again. Yes, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, giving interviews saying he's open to a comeback. He told ITV News that if the call came from Westminster, I'm not just going to turn away from it, which sounded a bit more like, call me anytime. Keir Starmer possibly not so grateful for that selfless gesture. My name is Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. I was surprised just how explicit Andy Burnham was, if I'm being honest, at the point where in public, at least, the Labour Party is tying itself up in knots on the questions of leadership. I have to say, Anne, I just want to give you an insight into last night. Such as the sensitivity around leadership issues, I went enthusiastically to the Labour Together bash. Just to recap, 24 hours ago, it emerged that the one-time Starmerite think tank was secretly doing polling of Labour members to ask if Keir Starmer was the right leader to take the party into the next election. So pretty sensational stuff, and it's been dominating Westminster conversations for the last 24 hours. And here we were at the organisation's own Christmas party. And what was really striking is they had a whole bunch of speeches and nobody dared even mention it. New boss Alison Phillips, ex-Daily Mirror editor, just ignored the topic, kind of putting in absolute highlights the fact that it's too sensitive and it's doing such damage to the Labour Together brand. I think nothing says they were hating every second of it more than actually just trying to sidestep it. After all the fuss, the room felt really, frankly, quite a lot more empty than previous Labour Together bashes. But kudos to Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, Hamish Faulkner, and Josh Simons for ignoring all of that and turning up. That was brave.
I love Christmas party politicking. And of course you were in the room, Sam Coates. Now, today is the penultimate PMQs of 2025, but much of the political action is really elsewhere. I'm in Brussels, where the European Trade Commissioner, Maroš Šefčovič, will be hosting Cabinet Office Minister Nick Thomas-Symonds for talks on that big British reconnection with Europe.
And 350 kilometres away in Strasbourg, there's another big epicentre of UK foreign policy. That's where Deputy Prime Minister David Lammy is heading. He's, of course, also the Justice Secretary, and it's his job to turn words into action. Keir Starmer and him are both calling on European leaders to curb human rights laws so that member states can take tougher action on borders and migration. It's a big topic. We'll come back to that in a moment.
Meanwhile, Shabana Mahmood looks set to reduce the number of police forces, maybe to around a dozen, according to the Times. The policing white paper was delayed to the new year. Some sort of felling of the number of forces now looks likely quite a big reform, that one, to take on.
Yeah, I think that the people around Shabana Mahmood weren't confirming the number. A dozen police forces is what the Times is saying we might get down to, but it does feel like that's the direction of travel. Also on the front pages, well, actually, there are extracts from my interview yesterday with Kemi Badenoch, where she hits back at a top NHS leader who said that people with flu symptoms should start returning to wearing masks in public. Kemi Badenoch told me that she was traumatised by the memory of mask wearing in the pandemic, and it was not the job of government to tell people to wear masks. We'll have a bit more from that interview, which goes into her political year later. And there is something set in the agenda from your stable that's really worth talking about, dominating the front pages here in Britain and the talk of Europe. Do you want to tell us all about it?
Yes, this is a huge conversation starter on the future of the US-European relationship, an interview by Politico's Dasha Burns in Washington with President Trump. And a really abrasive account there that the president gave of his views of Europe. He basically threw much of the continent really onto the bonfire in terms of the future of relations ahead. He denounced Europe as a decaying group of nations led by weak people, unable to control migration and unable to end the Russia-Ukraine war. Here are some of his views on Europe.
Well, Europe is a different place.
What do you mean by that?
And if it keeps going the way it's going, Europe will not be, in my opinion, many of those countries will not be viable countries any longer. Their immigration policy is a disaster. What they're doing with immigration is a disaster.
What you hear there and just comes across in spades in the whole interview, if you listen to it or read it, is just the virulence. It does not let up. It's a complete tear down, and it seems to signal almost an intent to create a rupture, particularly with countries like France and Germany. What did you think?
I think that watching the reaction to that interview is going to be quite defining. There is a conversation in Europe that we're about to talk about exactly the subject that Donald Trump is obsessing about, which is migration. That's the one that we'll talk about in a second in Strasbourg. Does the tone and the urgency of the people there reflect A, the views of the people around the continent, and B, the manner in which the US president is raising that item up the agenda? Look, I think this interview is going to rattle people. When it comes to migration, I think that European leaders sort of slightly cross their fingers but go along with it because they can see the president drawing a sort of direct line with his own domestic policy. They don't like it, but they can go along with it. But what's fascinating is that this interview crosses, I think, the line that everybody has, which is where Donald Trump starts talking about his preferred candidates all over Europe for election. He name checks Viktor Orban in Hungary. And I think that this is the bit that behind closed doors makes everyone go a bit crazy when the US president is picking and choosing. And there is always a fear that might happen in the UK at some point. At the moment, Keir Starmer's relationship with Donald Trump is good and strong, but there are parallel universes where it breaks down and the Trump administration might have views. I wonder whether it was a coincidence that, and I think it probably was, that the US ambassador to London, Warren Stevens, ended up in Downing Street talking to Keir Starmer just yesterday. We know about this because Warren Stevens has tweeted about it. He said that he was there to resume our ongoing diplomatic conversation about the US-UK partnership. Interesting that it needed resuming as if it had stuttered a little bit. And he talked about commitment to AUKUS, which is now kind of back on the agenda firmly with the Trump administration. They were talking about the desire to finalize trade agreements and recognition that has slightly stalled. And here was a sort of diplomatic sweetie from the Americans to the British. Warren Stevens says, in looking forward to 2026, I invited the Prime Minister to join our year-long celebration of the 250th anniversary of America's independence. Independence from who? Well, you can see the obvious historical sensitivities around that. So it was an important and delicate invitation to make on a day where the man with the megaphone on the other side of the Atlantic couldn't be painting more in primary colours.
Great upsum. At least it was an invitation, because most of it was just a lambast. It was invective. And when you say maybe behind the scenes there's sensitivity about this, I mean, in some cases, Sam, right in front of the door, Friedrich Merz in Germany, saying if democracy does need saving, he said rather snarkily about Donald Trump, we will do it ourselves. So you can feel, I think this is really fraying relations. Sadiq Khan in London came in for a pasting as well. A horrible mayor. Trump has got a thing about Sadiq Khan, I think we've talked about before on the podcast. An incompetent mayor, he said. Horrible, vicious, disgusting. Let's hear a bit of that appreciation for the man in City Hall.
I loved Paris. It's a much different place than it was. If you take a look at London, you have a mayor named Khan. He's a horrible mayor. He's an incompetent mayor, but he's a horrible, vicious, disgusting mayor. I think he's done a terrible job. London's a different place. I love London. And I hate to see it happen. You know, my roots are in Europe, as you know.
Well, Khan was quick to shoot back, and he sat down with my colleague Dan Bloom and said that the president seemed mysteriously obsessed with him and contended that Americans were in fact flocking to live in London. He told Dan because liberal values are the antithesis of Trump. So that was a shot straight back there, coming from the Thames.
What do we think the fallout is across the continent? And you're there. Just give me a quick glimpse of the feelings that you've been picking up about his intervention.
The substance of this, it seems to me, Sam, is that it comes at such a precarious moment in the negotiations to end Russia's war in Ukraine. Here in Brussels, there are just numerous forums and meetings going on at the moment on everything, particularly like the plan to release about 200 billion euro in frozen assets. That's been a bit stuck in the weeds, and how the loan backstop would work and all of that good Europe stuff, which is willing to do something, but it's still found a reason why it hasn't done it. Now, I wonder whether this will be the catalyst for moving on faster, because there are real fears now that Donald Trump will abandon Ukraine and its continental allies, in effect, to Russian aggression, partitioning the Donbass, saying, Russia, you take this bit, this is the best we can do, but no meaningful security guarantees to follow. And I think that really has changed in the last weeks. And the question will be, does it harden up the so-called E3 position, France, Germany, and the UK, meeting this week with Zelensky to support him, as well as, of course, Poland, the major power right next to Ukraine, and others, to act more in concert. We've been saying this, it has been happening in small steps. Is this the moment of reality when it becomes unignorable? Donald Trump no longer has our back. In fact, largely, he doesn't even like the continent very much.
Right. We'll see today whether or not European leaders were listening over the border from where you are and in Strasbourg. That's where the Council of Europe summit is taking place. Now, yesterday, the Prime Minister urged members to go further in modernising the interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights to prevent refused asylum seekers using it to avoid a deportation. That's a bugbear of the Prime Minister and Shabana Mahmood, the new Home Secretary. But it's the Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary David Lammy who has to fight the fight there today. But it's harder than you'd think. We have been here before.
We have been here before, but we are now hearing much more forthright acknowledgement, including from the Council of Europe boss, Alain Berset, that this is now such a big problem for many member states that he says many states have expressed concern about the role of the ECHR as they try to tackle migration. They were comments he made to my colleague Zoya Shevchevich last night. Now, you could say, well, you don't say, but at the same time, it does appear that we now have alliances building up there around countries like Denmark, the UK to a certain extent, who are governed often ostensibly by the centre left, but are saying we need help to tackle migration. ECHR needs to change.
What really strikes me about all of this, Anne, though, is that what success looks like. Because the processes that we're beginning now take an awfully long time. So if today's meeting is successful, that paves the way for a political declaration from Council of Europe members, likely in the spring. And then that leads to tangible reforms further down the line. So even though we'll get some kind of joint statement led by the UK for those up for reform after the meeting, it's not clear that we will be much further in substantive terms for many, many months, if not years. And in that space, I think the government is going to struggle with a sort of holding line that this is definitely the way forward, because attempts at meaningful reform have been scuppered in the past. Now, the political context has changed, but getting these bodies to agree substantive alterations is really, really hard. I remember David Cameron trying to do this, and every subsequent Prime Minister talking the talk on this and not succeeding. You have got other solutions. The Telegraph has been interviewing the leader of the National Rally Party, the far-right party. That's Jordan Bardella, something he could succeed President Macron. In the interview with the Telegraph, he was saying that if he got into power, if he got into the Elysee Palace, the UK would be allowed to push small boats carrying migrants back into French waters under immigration plans that he would endorse. He said he would rewrite French border policy to help the UK tackle the migrant crisis in the Channel. This is unilateral politics. Voters often understand that in a more easy and straightforward way than the multilateralism that takes a long time and isn't always successful.
Just a very quick thought on that, Sam. This was all part of the bruise that Donald Trump was punching on Europe, wasn't it? You're weak. You can't get on top of your own migration issues. You're not strong enough to deal with the end of the war. I mean, I think that's a somewhat unfortunate way to frame the war in Ukraine. But, there's just, as always, a germ of truth in what are you Europeans actually capable of delivering. Your leaders are not good leaders. He tends us to think that the kind of leadership that would be preferable would be his own. But, as much as many people will be very horrified by the president's comments and his worldview, there's just a slightly uncomfortable grain of truth in there, isn't there, in terms of efficacy and Europe. But it's what a week for interviews, and you've been sitting down as well with someone we know.
Yes, I got to go to an event by Kemi Badenoch yesterday about reforming welfare and getting people off welfare and into work. It was a glitzy thing in London Bridge. The Tory leader said that young people are turning away from jobs that they believe are beneath them. It wasn't an event with a big news announcement attached, which is why it sort of its form in all the different papers is a bit different, and perhaps as an event didn't leave a huge mark. But it was an opportunity for broadcasters to sit down with her afterwards, and I did that, and I kind of wanted. And I did this with listeners of this podcast in mind. I wanted to ask her what she made of her first year in sort of substantive year in power, but also what success might look like when she's tested for the first time properly at the May local elections in 2026. Listen to this exchange.
What I need to do is make sure that I'm not blowing around, just trying to win votes for the sake of it. I'm being honest. There's something going very wrong in our country. We need to get Britain working again. Too many people on benefits. Only one party is standing up for them, and that's the Conservative Party.
There is an election in 5 months' time. What would relative success look like in that?
Well, as I said, we're going to be fighting for every single vote. There are going to be local elections, not all over the country, and there is a Conservative message that I want everyone to hear. Our country is not working properly. There are fundamental things that need to change. We need to create jobs, otherwise we're not going to have money for councils. And we are the only party that is responsible. We've seen new parties like Reform come in. They're making a hash of things at council level. We need to make sure that people can see the benefits of voting Conservative.
That was a lengthy answer, but I asked you what success looked like. You didn't say winning.
Well, as I said, we're going to be fighting for every vote. I'm not
You're
going
still
to
not saying winning.
This is an answer that I've given and previous leaders have always given.
So not winning here yet.
So what I'm saying is that the country is going to decide. We are going to put out an offer and we're going to fight for every vote. I didn't say some votes. Success is going to be people seeing the Conservative Party as the only party that is competent and credible enough to do the tough stuff that this country needs.
So not winning yet.
The fascinating thing about next May, Anne, is because we might have one, or we might have two leaders in the shape of Keir Starmer being the other one, who could be under immense, possibly unsustainable pressure at that point. So fascinating, effectively, to hear Kemi Badenoch playing down expectations by not using that word winning. How did you interpret it?
Well, I was struck when you pushed Kemi there, Sam, that she defined success as fighting for every vote, as opposed to winning in May, which in effect, she seemed to acknowledge was off the table, or at least unlikely. But she seemed to be downplaying expectations of a great leap forward as well. That language of fighting for every vote. I mean, that's almost more like something you say on the night before the election, isn't it? To motivate your people to get out there. And the risk of this, I mean, I think everyone pretty much agrees she's had a much more successful autumn. She seems to have found her stride. I thought watching the clips of your interview, she seemed pretty confident, very much handling herself now in a much more secure way. But it can feel more like commentary rather than contention. She's only one point away from Labour in the polls. At some point, she has to perhaps make some promise of what a Conservative revival will actually look like. If it's simply, well, we're going to fight, but we don't think we're going to succeed, you could feel the air going out of that balloon over time.
Right. There's a lot to have packed into that episode of the podcast today, so we ought to wrap it up there. It's quite febrile at the moment in Westminster and in Europe where you are, so I look forward to closing the week tomorrow for Politics at Sam and Anne's with everything that we can bring you from the sort of the gutters of Westminster and Brussels. So we will see you in 24 hours for that.
See you tomorrow, Sam.